Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and my extended break while I was doing my 7-day Normandy tour. And some of the people who are on that tour are in the sidebar. Hello, Willie. Hello, others. I've got to remember how to do this again now because it's been a few days. But anyway, here I am. If you're new to the channel, if you found us while I haven't been streaming, don't forget all the information you need is in the description below. You'll find our merchandise links, links to other guests, other shows, other websites, etc., etc., etc. And if you might consider becoming a patron or a channel member, you'd be very welcome. But my guest today is Autumn Hendrickson, who has been researching men and women from her hometown in Massachusetts and how they served in World War II. So good afternoon, Autumn. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I am looking forward to this.
Good. You're all smiley, which is good. So tell us about yourself. Do you teach history or do you teach other subjects?
So I am currently a student teacher, and I'm in college studying English, but I do intend to get my license to teach history as well, hopefully so that I can teach humanities. That would be my happy place since I really love literature and I really love history. But yeah, so I'm right on the cusp of becoming a teacher, I guess.
Cool. And we will talk at the end of the show about what your project is and why you've been researching people from your small town. But from my point of view, it's always good when people have a particular reason for studying something. It's because in Europe, we've had people from the Netherlands and Belgium studying a division who passed through their town, or people because their relative was in a particular unit and that's where they came to the subject from. And in your case, it's a nice area to start. And I bet when you started it, you didn't realize how big it would go. You thought, oh, small town won't be more than a couple, and you ended up finding much far more.
Yeah, I realized I think the first like draft card I opened sorted for the town of Reading, Massachusetts happened to be one of 2,300 draft cards, and it was one of the 32 guys from town that was killed. So I realized pretty quickly, I was like, oh, okay.
And it's just an interesting way of looking at it. We'll get to it later because from the same place, they theoretically maybe had the same values and the same interests and the same background. And yet, as you will tell us, they went into different services and different branches, different locations. But you've come armor PowerPoint, which I'm in charge of today, folks. Fire away with questions as you come along. But I'm going to hand over to Autumn to take us through these four men from a small town in a big war. Over to you, Autumn.
Yeah, so I think it would be helpful to just give everyone a little bit of an idea of how large the town of Reading, Massachusetts was at this time. The population sat around 15,000 people. It was primarily a Republican community, which is actually kind of notable given the fact that FDR, who was a notably Democratic president, for whatever reason, the town of Reading did not like him. So it was a Republican enclave on the North Shore of Boston and Massachusetts. We're about, let's see, I want to say we're about, back then it was probably closer to 45 minutes into Boston. Nowadays it's more like 25 to 30. But Reading is also a very interesting place because it has a railroad. And not many other towns in our area can claim that they have like a railroad station in the middle of town. And so Reading, Massachusetts is literally characterized by which side of the tracks you live on, really.
Right.
It's run through the town. A guy in the 1870s successfully lobbied to get the railroad through Reading. And it's kind of everything since then, we've really developed around the railroad. The town at the time, too, just like some little fun facts, we had an organ making industry. We made organs for churches and stuff. That was an exciting thing. Another thing that we made, so we made a lot of shoes in Reading, which is very common on the North Shore of Massachusetts in general, and then into the industrial heartland, really, of Massachusetts, places like Lowell. But we had an organ making industry, and we also made clocks. And then the other thing I always tell people is Reading, Massachusetts is not to be confused for Reading, Pennsylvania, two very different places. So that is all I want to tell you about the town in general.
Brilliant. Well, we'll move on to our first person, and our first person is someone I met. I met him in Normandy years ago, so that's a good start because I do remember a lecture he gave in Santa Maria Glees in about 2003, something like that. So Yeah, Robert Martin Piper, 82nd Airborne. And my funny story about him, by the way, and then I'll let you get to him, is that
Yeah.
did this incredibly long, detailed presentation about the 82nd Airborne, history of paratroops, blah, 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 the All-American, the unit he was in. And there was a really youngish person in the crowd, maybe 16, 17. This was like a year after Band of Brothers had come out, too, which, of course, is 101st Airborne. And he said to Bob Piper at the end of this long lecture, he said, were you one of the Band of Brothers? And Bob Piper kind of went purple and then yellow and then red and then blue and then purple again. And you saw the veins in his neck were kind of throbbing. And he stood up and he said, while the 101st Airborne were busy making TV series, we were busy making history. Next question. Oh, brilliant answer. So that's my Bob Piper story. You can add that to your repertoire if you like.
I love that. That makes me so happy too, because I mean, our town has plenty of paratroopers from the 101st. We only have 2 guys from the 82nd, and I personally think the 82nd is quite fascinating, and I wish they got more attention than they do. They were kind of the first ones in. They kind of were the beta test for the airborne. And Bob Piper was on the cutting edge of it. And so he had a very long life. And he also, I think it's worth mentioning, he had an older brother, Benjamin, and Benjamin went into law. Bob took an interest in aeronautics. He went to the University of New Hampshire. He graduated with the class of 1941 with a Bachelor of Arts in English, which I that's what I'm going to graduate with. So
Right.
that makes me like, oh, okay, I see you, buddy. Um, and he took a course in flying. And it's my understanding that he actually he continued to fly later on in his life. And I kind of wonder too why he didn't go into the Army Air Corps, if they just didn't want him, or what exactly. But he was a fascinating man. And I wish I had gotten to meet him because he was so clearly very outspoken, and he definitely, like, there's not even another person from the town of Reading who can hold a candle to him and how outspoken and willing they were to speak about their experiences. Bob was like the only one from our community. And then his older brother Benjamin, and I like to tell people this because I think it's really fascinating, he served as an officer in the 17th Airborne Division.
Right.
So they both went into the airborne. And then Benjamin was a part of the 82nd Airborne's like Judge Advocate General section, I believe, during the Nuremberg trials. So
Wow. Well,
yeah.
I mean, for my memories of what Bob said at this talk, I think he said something on the lines of he was born to be a paratrooper and he was fascinated by the air, and he may have been one of those people that saw those kind of experimental photos of early
Yeah.
jump training, and although he could have been attracted by the Army Air Corps, the whole airborne concept may have been so, because the very first, the James Gavins of the world were pioneers of this, and it was a new
Yes.
thing, and so maybe he felt it was still in the air, but it was a different way of rather than flying through the air, is jumping out and hitting the ground through the air.
Yes.
But
No,
extraordinary guy. So back
100%.
to you.
Yeah, and he actually says there's a book, and I kind of have it here, his The Way We Were, and one of the things he says is that he thought that the airborne was the future. And so I think that might have been part of what his interest was in it, but nonetheless, we can go into talking about his training. Yeah, so these are all clippings, and I do apologize, of course, especially the big one on the top right is just hard to read, and that's the best I could get it. So these are clippings from the Reading Chronicle. You guys are going to see a lot of these as we go through. I just want to tell you that now, and also to kind of like, warning that, yeah, these were taken from microfilm. So when the quality is bad, that's why. And now they are OCR'd and digitized, but of course they weren't so I spent hours in the library during the summers just on the microfilm reader. But Bob Piper, so he was kind of an OG. He was around right at the beginning of the airborne. The whole concept of the airborne was something that he was really fascinated by from the get-go. He actually personally asked the commanding officer of then the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was at the time the only one, if he could join them, and they just didn't have space for an officer. And so he was sent out to California, and he kind of, mucked around with normal infantry out there. And actually, when Pearl Harbor happened, he was in California at that time. And then he was transferred. He was finally given the option to come back, and that's that clipping on the top left. Formerly stationed at Camp Roberts and Camp Cook, California, is now at Fort Benning, Georgia, with the 1st Parachute Training Battalion. So he was given the opportunity to come and train with the airborne. He successfully qualified. He got his jump wings. And he sent this really sweet letter home, and that's what's in the top right. And I'll pull it up on my end so that I can actually, because it is even smaller doing it this way. But he said some of the things that he said were really sweet, and he was very proud of it. Like, and it shows in a lot of the things that he wrote home. But yeah, he said he said, I was able to do quite a little traveling in the West and really enjoyed it. I received my first lieutenancy just before leaving Camp Cook, July 11th, for the parachute school here at Fort Benning. We are on our first week of training, and if all goes well, we'll have our wings in another 3 weeks. Well, enough of my doings. Let me thank you again, and hope I'll be able to thank you personally before long. So he wrote a lot. And he got his wings. He was assigned to the 505th. He ended up, his first assignment was with Company G of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And then he was made, I believe he was made company executive of that company. And then I'm not quite sure, and the timeline is a little hazy, but we do know he was made the regimental S1 sometime before they went overseas. Whether he assumed all those duties right away, I don't know. But he was like on a short list at the very least, and then I think he might have spent some time in North Africa while they were waiting to go into Italy, and then he finally, he assumed all the duties. But yeah, so if you want to go into combat, we can talk about that.
And it makes sense because in the early days of both airborne divisions, well, and the 101st, 82nd, indeed in the British, is that they tried officers and NCOs with different skills in different areas to kind of find the perfect team. So you find that once they get into combat, people tend to stay in a unit and in a role until they get either promoted or wounded. But in the pre-combat, they do shuffle people around a lot, just trying to find out where people's skill sets are best suited. But so you see that a lot with people shuffled around from mortar to platoon to platoon to S1. So that from what my memories, and I've got the book as well. I've got the book. Yeah, he clearly was very bright and very, very good at what he did, and it wasn't just some soldiers are very, very good at combat, but they don't necessarily have skill sets outside of that. He obviously was very intelligent, very sharp, and so they're obviously putting him in different roles.
Yes, no, 100%. And one of the things that I think really shows that to me too. So his older brother became a lawyer. His older brother went to Reading High School. Robert did not. He went to a private academy in Maine. And to me, I mean, maybe that's because he's the younger brother, maybe the family had more money. I don't know. But if I'm a family growing up, or raising children, in the Depression era, I'm not sending a kid who's not very bright, to a private academy school out of state. Definitely not. And so I think, and he participated in so many things too. He liked to act, he sang, he was in the orchestra, he played on the lacrosse team. He did everything. And then of course when he went to UNH, he immediately took an interest in ROTC.
Mm.
And that's how he got involved in the military, I believe, in the first place. I think that's how he got it, especially given the fact that he got his commission just based on like the documents that I have on him. He got his commission, like the way it looks, he got his commission as soon as he entered the service. So it's like ROTC,
Yeah,
definitely.
makes sense.
Um, yeah. And he excelled at, I think, almost all the things he tried to do. Um, at least from every indication, which is really, really amazing. Um, he was very smart, and I think he was also very good with people, because as a regimental S1, I mean, he also always he did say that he had always had a soft spot for G Company since that was where he had started. So he often would admit, yeah, I probably knew a lot of those guys, maybe more, but he knew all the guys in the division. He knew a lot of guys, and he was very like, I always think it's funny. He was so nonchalant about the fact that he got wounded, because he gets wounded by shrapnel in the knee in Sicily. He doesn't really say anything other than "I didn't get evacuated," which to me is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
In fact, sometimes it's easy to overlook the fact that he was wounded because he served in so many campaigns, that, it's almost like he really came out without a scratch, because the wound that he had was, I presume, superficial. If it was a knee wound and he wasn't evacuated, but he liked to send home the things that he was like, that his division was given. Like, there was a letter that was, I believe, written by a mayor of a French town. I can't remember which one, but it was given to the 82nd Airborne like Division HQ, I believe, and he got a copy of it and sent it home to Reading. But yeah, I love the line that the whoever the editor was for the Reading Chronicle chose, shoots in to shoot up Sicily. Very clever. But he wrote home a lot. He was always trying to see if he could see his brother too. Because as soon as his brother entered the service, they were like, "Ooh, maybe we'll actually get to see each other." And they, spoiler alert, they do end up getting to see each other. So
Mm.
only
Mm.
once, only the once, but they do. Uh, but I do always think too, it's amusing when he gets into Normandy, and that's the bottom left clip there. He, his note just said that he was well and that he was unable to write much at that time. I think maybe an understatement. One of the most surprising things about Bob for me was when I got some records of the 505th from a friend, some archival documents signed by Robert M. Piper because he was the one who wrote them.
Right.
um, so I had spent like a few hours like reading this cursive and like cursing this guy's handwriting at times, and then I was like, Bob? Oh, I should have noticed, but it's one of those things that it's hard to remember. It's like, oh right, he's the S1. He's writing the S1 journal. And at one point, he in the Normandy journal too, he makes an addendum on the like to the journal itself, like almost like an author's note, and says, "Look, this is incomplete because we lost it a few times. Like we had to move." Like he said at one point, the regimental CP where he was at got like ambushed at least once, so they lost some of the papers, and then the other papers were lost by a runner, and and so it was like a mess. um but he was there right through to the end. I know that he told a story specifically about Sicily, um where he said like that was the first time he was in combat. um and he kind of got surrounded a little bit, and he had like, I think the story goes that he had about 5 paratroopers with him. They were by a road and they saw a column of German soldiers marching down the road, and the German soldiers did not even know they were there. And so like he said, the first shot of the war that I fired was into a guy's back. He didn't even see us. We took them out. They didn't even know we were there. So it was pretty wild stuff. He Go ahead. Were you going to say something?
I was going to say, this may apply to the Bob, and maybe not the other three. Is that because there is a book about him where it's both his recollections and Michel de Trey who co-authored the book that it was written out there. But the micro features from the newspapers, did you find there any kind of contradictions in that? Because it's an interesting when people contact me and say, how can I research my relative, and they get the service records, and I always say, have you looked at local newspapers, because they're desperate for information in these small towns about their own folk, so that they can share with their own people what their sons are doing. But I don't expect they got a huge amount of information to work with. That's hence why they kind of make a title and go, well, I like the bit about not much to report. They're trying to make a news story out of very little. But did you find any contradictions, or did it kind of tie up what the newspaper was saying with what the book said that he wrote years later?
It's interesting. I mean, in general, I think for Bob in particular, like specifically Bob, there's no contradiction at all. But one thing that I do notice is that these newspapers, invaluable resource. I mean, I can't imagine where I would be without them, because there are some stories in the newspapers that I never would have known. I never would have known. Like, we have one guy, Leslie Kendall. He walked through Yugoslavia with Yugoslav partisans for like 500 miles, and they helped him back to American lines. I never would have known that ever in a million years. I never would have found that out. But he wrote home about it.
Service records aren't trying to give an emotional story for people. They're just a record. They are what they say they are. They're recording dates and times and places, but a newspaper is trying to tell a story. So if you, in your case, if you're trying to find that depth, then a newspaper, because a journalist writing these is trying to make content for his readers. There is a story that about making it more exciting than just a record of assignments.
Yes, and a lot of the newspaper published letters that were sent home too, and that was what the case with Leslie Kendall. They literally published the letter he wrote to his mother. The censorship was an issue because sometimes you don't see, like, it won't say the guy's unit, and that's always like very frustrating, especially if I'm having a really hard time figuring it out. But I also find that sometimes the newspaper is just blatantly wrong. Like, and that's even worse sometimes, because the information, like, there was one guy who I was researching just yesterday, Alfred Smith, who was a pilot, and he trained in, I didn't find this out until like there was a post-war, like 1946 mention in the newspaper of where he trained, but like when they were talking about where he was training, when he was actually training, they weren't saying where. They were just saying Camden, South Carolina. But like the next guy, they were saying, the specific field, and it's like infuriating. It's like, just tell me the field. So the inconsistencies in the newspaper can be very, very frustrating. And then of course you can see in this image, especially that the image on the far right, perfect example of what happens to photographs in newspapers that are microfilmed. You can barely see him.
Yeah.
So the two photos that are there of him that you guys are seeing, just so that you know, the top one is of Mr. Piper out after setting up the regimental CP outside of St. Mary-Église. And then the bottom one is he's holding his grease gun. I believe this was taken on the 7th of June, 1944. He's in the background is a crashed Horsa glider that he's standing in front of. And I've been led to believe that bottom picture is a little bit more well-known than most of the other photos of him. So if you've seen something like that, now you know who it is.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I haven't looked at his book for a while, but there are lots of photos in it. He was obviously, quite proud of what he was doing, and I think he wouldn't mind us saying he had a bit of an ego. He kind of liked. He was proud of what he did. He obviously knew he was good at what he did. That the lecture I attended, there was no wishy-washiness in his, I was there all the way through. We did all this. We helped win the war. The 82nd was the finest unit ever went into combat. There was no I mean, he was humble about his own achievements, but he was very
Yeah.
proud of what his unit had achieved, and he was
Of the
happy.
team, proud
And
of
I
the
was there.
team.
We did this. What we
Yeah.
did was important. I was intelligence officer. I gathered this. I'd rather that than someone just sort of downplaying everything to the point where there's no content. He was a very strong, forceful personality, and that
Yeah.
you need those to win wars for you.
Certainly, yeah. It brings to mind one man from town who was so dedicated to writing home. He wrote home every single day. And when the war finally ended, he wrote to his mother and he said, "I can finally tell you how proud I am of the 30th Infantry Division."
Wow.
And he was so he wrote this lengthy letter about it. So yeah, I mean, that pride that he had definitely seeped into the way that he talked about his experiences, and just the way he showed up in the paper, and also the way his parents, because it was usually the parents who would reach out to the newspaper and say, XYZ. And so his parents, that pride, I think his parents held it too. So
Good.
yeah.
And we've got a question that's appropriate from Bob. Sorry if I missed this, but does Autumn trace and speak to family members as well for your research?
That's a really great question. So I have a policy for myself. I do it on some occasions, I very rarely seek out and actively reach out to family members of individuals I'm researching, because I've had very bad experiences with that. I've had some people who are like, most of the bad experiences are like, "You're like a 21-year-old woman. Why do you care?" And then it's like, and then they don't want to give me information. It doesn't matter if oh, I'm just interested in learning. Then they don't really want to. There's not buy-in, and so that's something that happens too. Is in general, even when relatives do come to me, which sometimes they do, every now and then, I've had this happen where I don't have a photo I don't have photos of most of these guys.
Hmm.
And, a family member I'll send them the information I have on their family member. I'll never hear from them again.
Hmm.
So it can be really hit or miss. I want to say I have about 857 guys I'm researching. Out of those 857, I want to say I'm in touch with relatives of maybe 40. And I regularly correspond with and actively feel comfortable reaching out with random questions to maybe 10 of those relatives.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because as a historian with a website myself, I get inquiries from family members saying, "Can you look into this?" Go that, and I've not done the math, the data recently, but I probably only get a response to 1 in 3 of my responses. So they contact me out of the blue and they say, "Can you help with this?" And I will say,
Yeah.
"Have you tried getting this? Have you applied for his lights here? Here's a good resource." I give the website, blah blah blah. Probably, yeah, only 1 of 3 then respond to that, and it does make me wonder why bother to reply when they don't even come back
Yeah.
and say thanks for that, or even if they're disappointed that what I said wasn't what they wanted to hear, or that wasn't very much
Yeah.
anything else. But folks, if you're watching this and you email someone and ask for advice, and then they send you something, at least acknowledge it and say thanks very much, even if it wasn't the information you wanted, even if it wasn't as detailed, because I don't have to do this. I don't get paid for that, but it is interesting that maybe your age in that sense is working against you. I found as a tour guide when I was younger, people didn't take what I said as seriously as I've got older. There's a certain credibility comes with age. Oh, you've been doing it for 20 years. Oh, okay, I'll tell you this. And how long are you doing it? A year. Oh, well, you can. I don't want to help. It's interesting that how and gender probably comes into it as well. Unfortunately, tragically.
I definitely, I mean, yeah, the fact that I'm a woman has definitely impacted. Thankfully, I haven't really had issues with relatives re that, but when I go to reenactment stuff, it's everyone looks at my boyfriend and my boyfriend's like, "No, no, 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 no. She's the one. Talk to her." But
Oh yeah,
I do.
yeah. We've had that situation where people automatically assume the guy is the one with the interest, and often it is, but not always. Not always.
Yeah, no. And I mean,
It's a false
I do
assumption.
think,
But we're digressing into talking about email protocol and
yes.
historians. But it is interesting because as someone myself, it's interesting how the research process works, what kind of
Yes.
rules you impose because of because of this situation. It is interesting. But anyway, so we've kind of done Bob's combat. Let's move on to the
Go
post-war
on,
years.
yeah.
We've got 3 more to go. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, so Bob Piper, I love this story, and I actually love some of these photos of him with Stevie, as the guys would call her, or Steve. Evelyn is her name. But I really like, so she was a donut girl. She was like a Red Cross girl. She was assigned to the 505th. And it was Bob's job to watch her. So the colonel basically said to him before the invasion, because that's when she joined them, Evelyn Stevens, she joined the 505th as their Red Cross girl in April 1944, and promptly Robert was summoned to a desk and told, I don't want to be worrying about a woman before my invasion, so you're going to worry about her. And so, like, they had to post guards outside of the showers, so she could shower.
Wow.
And that was Bob's job. Bob's job was to just make sure she was okay, keep an eye on her. And I mean, at first it was, I presume at first it was probably a little bit of a contentious relationship, because if I'm Bob, I'm probably thinking, so you're having me babysit a woman? Like, that's what you're asking me to do? Like, really? But they became close friends, and Bob eventually got to the point where he was annoying her like all the time. But so she did not come with them to Normandy, but she did come with them into Germany and Belgium. She was with them during the Battle of the Bulge. And there are some adorable photos of her and Bob with Stahlhelms on, like surrounded by snow, like, and so that's how they fell in love. What a meet cute. They served alongside each other. They had wanted to get her combat jump credit, I believe, but they never got it. They never got permission to even let her jump, which she was very upset about. But after the war ended, he proposed to her, and they were married in June of 1945. It was the first, I believe it was the first wedding in France for the 82nd, 505th at least. And yeah, it was quite an affair. And of course, he sent home the telegrams, to tell his parents. And the best part of it, though, his brother was able to make it. Which I think is really sweet, because he was in theater, and so he got to show up to his brother's wedding, and kind of gate crashed it a little bit. It was a surprise. It was a surprise. Bob didn't know that Benjamin was coming, so.
Wow. So I mean, and his story does encapsulate everything, as you said earlier, about a young, ambitious, intelligent guy who wants to go to war, tries a new branch, excels at it, tries a few roles in it, and as I remember from the lecture, he wasn't just talking about his own experience, because he was the intelligence in that area. He knew what the operations were about. He knew why they were going there. He had a depth of knowledge that some combat veterans don't. Some classic veterans' memoirs, they never quite knew what the division was meant to be doing or where they were going or because that's not their role. But Bob Piper did, because he was in a position of understanding the intricacies of what the German units were and what the German units were trying to do and what the Allies were trying to do. So he brought a complexity to his understanding of it. I mean, his presentation about the 82nd was as good as and better than one done by a historian. It was a historian's presentation delivered by a veteran, whereas normally a veteran's presentation with a historian's presentation to kind of follow it or accompany it. He did both. It was everything was there. And then apart from the guy who said, "Well, you a band of brother," that was a really good. And the room went silent. Everyone looked at this poor kid like, "No, you've."
I would have wanted to crawl into a hole and die, honestly. Like secondhand embarrassment.
It was so funny, and Bob Piper couldn't have been wearing more 82nd Airborne paraphernalia if he tried. It wasn't just it was the he had flags behind him and photos and medals, and it was clearly obvious. I mean, the banner outside the hall said Bob Piper, 505th 82nd Airborne. But I think this lad was about 17 or 18. I feel he may have even been a reenactor. I feel I can't remember whether he was wearing a jump jacket, and he put his hand up. Were you one of the band of brothers? And yeah, it was funny. But anyway, that's Bob Piper, and if you're doing the equivalent work on another, what was it, 857? If it's 856, you get this far with you've got several books ahead of you, I think. But let's move on to Henry Merritt.
Yeah, so Henry Merritt is he's a really fascinating guy. So he was one of 11 children, by the way. He had 4 older brothers. Interestingly, none of the 4 older brothers served in World War II. It was all of the younger brothers. And he had three younger sisters. Like it was oh my gosh, such a big family, really a massive family. And they lived on Deering Street in the town of Reading forever, for generations. So the Merritt family is kind of synonymous. I mean, they're a big family. I don't think that many people from Reading know of them now because they're not around anymore. But like they were like that Merritt, Reading, 1940s, 30s. Yeah, big family. A lot of people knew who they were. And so Henry, and just like kind of some fun facts. So Henry's younger brother, one of his younger brothers, Edwin Russell Merritt, was a member of the 103rd, the 102nd Infantry Division. Excuse me, 405th Infantry Regiment. He was wounded in action, and then he had another brother who was in the Navy on a tugboat. But Henry was an officer, and so we can get into him.
Right. Yep. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So he was an officer. He got his commission. He had served with a bunch of different divisions. Like if you can see it there, it says like he was with the 31st something battalion, I believe, and then the 9th division and the 78th division, and it's like he was all over the place. I don't know why he kept getting bumped around. But he was basically an NCO for a long time, and then he finally got his commission in 43. And then he pretty quickly got shipped out. So he was attached to all those divisions, and then finally he got his assignment to Company B of the 337th Infantry Regiment, 85th Division, the Custer Division. And so they go over into Italy, and so we can go right into the next slide for his combat. So he had the 85th Division. I think that through this project, I've really come to have a soft spot for all of the guys who fought in Italy, because no one talks about what happened in Italy after Rome. No one does. And we had a guy killed after Rome, and no one really seems to know what was even happening. Well, Henry Merritt could tell you. So Henry, this is kind of a funny thing with him. So on the newspaper clipping on the right, it says Reading officers slept with armed Germans, 10 armed Germans. And he claimed, I presume in a letter home, that's how he won his Silver Star. But we have his Silver Star citation. We know it has nothing to do with that. And so I don't know. And so in my head, when I learned this, I was like, oh my God, either this is the biggest humble brag ever, or he just didn't want to tell people. He didn't want people to think. He didn't want people to have any sort of images of him in their head. I think that he was clearly a very brave guy, though, because that citation is absolutely insane. And I'll pull it up in front of me and just read it. It's kind of wild. So Henry C. Merritt, 1st Lieutenant Infantry, Company B, 337th Infantry Regiment, for gallantry in action on April 20th, 1945 in Italy, when his company was subjected to devastating enemy artillery and machine gun fire from 2 positions. Lieutenant Merritt, the company commander, so he must have been the ranking officer. I don't think a 1st lieutenant, I guess it's possible it was a sustained tenure, but could have also just been that the CO was killed. The company commander boldly set out to destroy the enemy emplacements. Working his way forward despite withering enemy fire, he threw 2 grenades into the hostile dugouts and succeeded in killing 2 and wounding one of the enemy machine gun crew. Determined to destroy the second emplacement, he continued to crawl forward. Although momentarily stunned by the concussion of enemy grenades, which burst all about him, Lieutenant Merritt boldly fired his submachine gun, wounding one German soldier and killing 2 others by the skillful use of grenades. I mean, kind of wild. Sounds like he kind of just went on a rampage there and said, okay, if you guys aren't going to do it, I'm going to do it. Follow me. And that's exactly what happened. That is what happened. B Company and that the 1st Battalion in general on that day, they were trying to move forward. I believe they were along a road, if I remember the after action reports that I read earlier today. They were along the road and they came upon a set of positions that were on a hill. And so he basically, I think he probably was just having a hard time getting his company to go. And so he was like, all right, I'll do it. Just come after me. And they did take out the positions. They moved into the area and everything was fine. But I mean, I think it's especially kind of wild just because of his age. Like he was in his like mid-30s ish. He had like been to the hospital a few times, like hospital admission cards for like, you know, issues with his knees, like, you know, like muscle, like I think like muscle like tendonitis and like a few times. And he just like ran up a hill. It was like, okay, get him, guys. He was quite a fella. And the Army Signal Corps photo in the middle on the bottom there, he's like the second figure on the left. He's just kind of standing behind everyone. But this was when the Germans surrendered to some of the Germans in the area surrendered to the 85th Division in the late days of the war. He was a very decorated officer, and yeah, so when he came back, and this is what we're about to get to. So after the war, he came home. He decided to stay in the service. It's really hard to actually find out kind of what happened to him between 1945 and 1950. I do know that he married. He married a woman named Lois Sumner of Florida. I don't know how he met her. I presume maybe he met her when he was like moving around to different stations in the Army, but he met her, and then he went off to Korea. He was a member of Company E, 9th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Division, and he was killed September 1st, 1950. His body was one of the ones that was turned over to the Americans in an exchange. It was like a body exchange, basically. The North Koreans had been holding these bodies like hostage for a while. They had not turned them over. And so we actually didn't get his remains back until, I believe, 55. They were only able to ID him through dental records. And his IDPF is like, it's brutal. It's like gruesome because it's like measurements of all his bones. You know, it's like, it's really brutal. But his wife, I think this is so sweet. And it, in a way, I just wish that the Army had made, or well, Arlington Cemetery had made an exception just for this one man, because his wife wrote to the War Department and asked, basically, I've remarried, but could you save the spot next to him that was going to be saved for me, for his daughter, who was born 2 days after he was killed?
Wow.
And Arlington National Cemetery said no. That's reserved for spouses only. And the only way that a child could be buried there is if the spot happens to be open. Which of course it wouldn't be open. I believe she passed away in the early 2000s, but I think it's really striking, especially for the town of Reading, because the town of Reading, I believe we only lost four or five men in the Korean War. I think just 4 men in the Korean War. 3 of them were World War II veterans, and Henry, of course, was one of them. So, you know, he
Sorry to interrupt. It begs the
no.
question for me. You start off researching these men and women who served, but then you find out about the child born after the guy's death. That's another potential avenue for research, but it's not quite within what your original intentions were. Do you
Yeah.
pursue that and kind of, because that becomes interesting, but then you start deviating from your purpose, so are you tempted to kind of follow some of these trails and see where they go, or would it get too complicated? Because then the descendants start moving away from Reading, and then they start traveling around the world, and then suddenly it loses what you started it as.
Yeah, sometimes that happens. We've got a few guys. So the other man who we have with a similar situation is a man named John Russell Byrd, who was Army aviator, present at the bombing of Pearl Harbor at Schofield Barracks. He was a B-17 flight instructor at the time. He flew at the Battle of Midway. And he married his wife on like a shore leave in Hawaii. He was killed October 30th or 31st, I can't remember which, 1942, in a plane crash. He lived for 2 days after, but he wasn't responsive. Very serious head trauma. And his wife had a son the following year, April, I think March or April 1943. And she named him John Russell Byrd Jr. And that was the only child that she had. She never remarried. And then there were Charles Norman Bailey is another story that sticks out to me. His is very emotional. In fact, tomorrow is the anniversary of his death. He was killed on his 30th birthday in Italy. He was the one who was killed after Rome, serving with the 88th Division. He was married. He was one of the dads. He was in that first wave of parents that were drafted. Because for the longest time, the U.S. waited until like early 44 to draft people with dependents. He had a wife and 5 kids. By the time that his remains were returned to the town of Reading in 1948 to be buried, one of his sons had died of cancer. And then 2 years after his remains were buried in Reading, his wife died of cancer, leaving the rest of the children without parents. And his parents, like Charles's parents, were dead. Most of his siblings were dead. In fact, one of his siblings had died in childhood. So it's like, it was brutal. Like things like that, it's hard not to get drawn into that. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, well, I'm going to ask you later on about, well, I'm going to ask you now as it's coming up in my head. All these soldiers you're researching, do you kind of move forward on an Eisenhower broad front and try and nudge all the cases, or do you kind of work on one for a while? Do you have lots open on your desktop? How does the process work? Because obviously some you reach dead ends and some you get better. So how do you tackle it?
It's because I have so many, I tend to really do it on whims. Like if I watch the Pacific, I just rewatched the Pacific. I've spent the past 2 weeks going through a lot of my Marines again.
Right.
Making sure, fixing up, making sure I've gone through all the muster rolls, making sure I've got X, Y, Z. Whenever I watch Greyhound, I end up going through all my Navy guys. And so, but every now and then, like it'll hit me like whenever someone asks me or I think of, for whatever reason, like, oh, Army Air Corps, my first thought is like Paul William Connolly, Alfred Bertrand Smith, Benjamin Robert Guild, who we're about to talk about. Like, I mean, that's kind of how it goes for me, is because I have like this encyclopedia of like random names. Sometimes I'll just think about one. I'll be like, oh, okay, let me look at him or refresh my memory, or, so that's kind of how it goes, I guess, if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does, definitely. We'll move on to, and Andreas is asking, is it 147 or 157 you're working on?
I think it's 857, but that number fluctuates because I'm always finding more guys.
And Andreas is asking, how does that what are your rules for being from Reading or North Reading? Because people
So
enlist
yeah.
in different places as well. You might be from somewhere, but you enlist in a different state. Or what if you've just moved there a year earlier? How does any connection to Reading count, or do you have criteria?
So I mean, I should preface this by saying that the town of Reading sent, I believe, somewhere north of 1,200 men to war. Of course, a lot of those guys are guys who were like never left the U.S. or served in like very rear echelon units. So
Right,
these 857, although some of them are rear echelon guys, they are the ones who I've deigned most interesting and most likely to actually be able to acquire operational documents on.
right,
Because like
okay,
there are some guys, like there are twin brothers from town who served in the same battalion, and I reached out to the National Archives. They don't have anything on record for the battalion, like nothing. So um but how I do it is anyone who lived in the town of Reading or North Reading during or after the Second World War, ideally for an extended period of time. But there's like this one guy who there are two guys that I think of that I kind of have made exceptions for. One of them is Stuart Parker Guinan, who his family moved to Reading right before he was drafted. And he was drafted like summer of 44. He went on to be killed in April 1945, and he won the Distinguished Service Cross as his
right,
dying action. Um, so that, I mean, he's like, I adore him because he looks like a little baby. Like the
right.
surface portrait I have, I mean, he was like 18. He was killed less than his parents got the telegram that he was killed on VE Day.
Oh, yeah,
Like
tragic.
VE Day, like
Yeah,
afternoon, they got it, and I can't that there's him, and then there's Joseph Warren Keenan, who he really only died in Reading. Like he lived the last year of his life in Reading, and I believe the only reason why he lived in Reading was because one of his children did. And so I
right.
think one of his children took care of him. So like,
Because
you know,
we're going down a massive rabbit hole, but it brings up the question of how people identify where they're from. I, as an Englishman
yes.
living in Normandy, people say to me, "How do you see yourself?" And I go, "Well, I'm English, but I'm also British. I also think of myself as a European. I'm also because I live in France. I'm not a Normand, but I'm Normand by choice. I choose to live here, and some of these people you're writing about, how would they, if they were here now, how would they define themselves? Would they define
Yeah.
themselves would they say East Coast? Would they say Massachusetts? Would they say Reading? Would they say, like Bill Garnier, South Philadelphia? He never just said Philadelphia, he said South. So it's interesting what people's
Yeah.
criteria are themselves about where they describe
Oh
themselves.
yeah.
As we get to towards the end of the show, we talk about where you're going with this. A potential book or series of books, the more areas you've covered, the more branches of service, the more theaters your young men and women went to, the more interest the public have in it, and I guess also the more different ways of connecting with Reading. Yeah, the people, like you said, the Merritt who are kind of synonymous with that town, going back to kind of when it wasn't a town, to someone who's just arrived there for work in 1939.
Mhm.
They're still from that time.
Yeah.
So that raises all these questions about identity and place, and where do you consider home? Is home your birth on your birth certificate, or is home is where you make a life for yourself? It's
Yeah.
these are imponderable rhetorical questions, but I
No,
find them
one
very interesting.
100% too. And I do feel like it's worth mentioning. I'm sure there are plenty of guys who I will include in my book who, I mean, I don't think any of them will be rolling in their graves, but I'm sure some of them will be like, I'm from Chelmsford. I'm from Chelsea.
Yeah.
I lived in Reading for 20 years after the war and I hated every second of it. Like,
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That I tried all my life to get away from that damn place, and other people, all I thought about when I was in the Pacific was getting back to my hometown. That paradox of the same place meaning different things to different people depending on the memories you've had there. If your parents broke
exactly.
up there when you were a child, you might have hated the place. If it's where
Yeah.
your sweetheart accepted your proposition, you might love the place. It's really
Yeah, and I make no claim to say like, oh, I knew he loved Reading. You
yeah.
know, it's like I don't know. He died
It's
20
it's a
years
connector.
before I was
It's
born.
no less or worse valid as a connector for a book than writing about a division or writing about a campaign.
Yes.
People ended up
Yeah.
there randomly. The units that fought through. You mentioned Rome earlier. They didn't
Mhm.
necessarily choose to go through, and that's where they ended up. So you write
Yeah.
about that. And these people, by happenstance of their birth, or their moving, or their parents, ended up having a connection with this town, and that's why you're including them in your research. And that sort of thing.
Yes.
Anyway, we're going down a massive great rabbit hole.
Sorry.
Let's get to our next. No, it's fine. I'm enjoying the conversation. Let's get to our next of the three.
Yeah. Bernard Robert Guild. So he was called Ben. Um, he's in this picture. I believe he is the second guy on the left there. He's the one that's right behind like the newspaper,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
So he was an Army Air Corpsman. So he was a radio man and a gunner. He served in the 321st Bombardment Group, 447th Squadron. Yes, 447th Bombardment Squadron. He was really cool. So he kind of joined the like 321st right after, if it helps, like a few months after the big week. I mean, he
Right.
wasn't a part of the big week, and I don't think the 321st was 8th Air Force at all, because I think they were based in Italy. But either way, timing wise, that should help you understand. So he's coming in after one of the biggest bombing campaigns of, like, the Army Air Forces.
Mhm.
And he flies 48 missions before he is shot down. So I mean, he goes all over the place. He spends time at all these different fields. And I have like the postcard there, Lowry Field. That was one of the fields he was at. Um, but he trained, and he had a brother who was in the Navy. And so I like to think like two very different worlds. It was just the two brothers. But Daniel served in the Navy during the war. So we can get into his combat here. So yeah, so he, like I kind of alluded to, he flew 48 missions, a lot. He was a part of a lot of different things. I mean, he was primarily, he also flew a mission for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. He was part of that bomber force that helped kind of lead them in, I guess. But his first mission was flown May 18th, 1944. And then for some reason, he does not fly a mission from May 27th to August 15th. I have no idea why. There's no indication in the newspaper as to why. My guess is maybe he hurt himself, or he was sick, or I have no idea. So it's very, very odd that there's such a gap. I've never seen such a large gap with no explanation. But yeah, so he flew two missions on August 15th, though, for Dragoon. And then he just railroad bridges, road bridges. Like, I mean, I'm looking at the missions that he flew. I have them in front of me right now. That was what he was doing. And the 321st and a lot of like the 15th Air Force, what I've come to understand is that they were like more tactical, I think, than like strategic when it came to bombing. Like they were more likely. So, and this is something I'm still learning to understand, but like tactical bombing is like you're bombing specific things like that are of purpose.
Theoretically, you're supporting the ground forces as
Yes,
opposed to
thank you.
strategic being supporting
Yeah,
the war effort. But of course, it's a much more blurred line. And the 15th Air Force definitely is much more blurred. With the 9th Air Force, they're and the 8th Air Force out of England, they're quite
yeah,
delineated in their role. But the 15th are doing whatever anyone wants them to do that particular week.
yes,
And it can be high level, low level, bridges, or more kind of area bombing. So the 15th Air Force got to do a little bit of everything from my limited knowledge.
yeah. Yeah, so he bombs a lot of railroad bridges, all sorts of stuff, and then his crew gets shot down over Italy on February 6th, 1945. They get shot down, and two of the guys are killed. The pilot and the co-pilot. They're actually found with the plane, and they were identified. And I think this must have been horrific. They were identified by Ben and some of the other crew members, because they walked them over to the plane and said, who sits here, because the bodies were so burned they couldn't. And so they had to see that. That was one of their, first, like, okay, you're a prisoner of war now. Here, come identify your dead friends. I mean, unpleasant, very unpleasant. But thanks to their identifications, though, they were able to return those remains home at the end of the war. So, I mean, worth it. In my book, I'm sure probably for them too, at least in hindsight. But so he was captured. He was held in, originally he was held in Stalag, what's it, 7A, I think. No, he was marched there. He was held in Stalag 13, and then he was marched to Stalag 7. So he was shot down February 6th, 45. It's already 45, so he doesn't have a long period of captivity. Like, we do have guys who had much longer periods of captivity. Like, I think the longest one would probably be, we had one guy shot down in 1943. So, but he spends all of his time, and then, like so many other guys, and this is one of the reasons why I picked him, aside from the fact that he flew so many missions and then still somehow ran out of luck, he gets death marched. As the Russians continue to push the Germans back, Stalag 13 is evacuated, and they are marched to Stalag 7. And so that march began on April 13th. It ended on April 20th. So 7 days, no stopping. I mean, I think I read somewhere, and I apologize, I can't remember where I read it, but that on that march, it was so bad that even some of the German guards, because some of the German guards were like older guys, and they were almost struggling as much as the
Yeah, no,
POWs were.
we did a show with Holly Harris a few weeks ago, whose great uncle, I think, or great uncle was involved, and that having been very much in the camps, them and us, prisoners and guards, the march kind of made everybody, they're all facing exactly the same conditions, and there was actually
Yeah.
some limited camaraderie between them, because they were older Germans. They weren't horrible, nasty SS guys. And so yeah, that is a story that came out of that, is the shared experience of just the cold and the distance and the lack of weather gear and suitable footwear, and etc.
Yeah, and so I mean, what makes Ben's story particularly poignant is that he was awarded a medal after he was reported missing. And I think it's just it's a lot, because I don't think that it's ever nice to get mailed your son's medal by the War Department instead of from your son. And so many of the guys, sent their medals home, and we know that because it'll come up in the newspaper and say, oh, so and so received Jimmy's Purple Heart that he sent from the hospital in Italy, and it's like, no, like, they, she got this like heartfelt message from E.A. Bradunas, whoever that is, I don't know, like, on that right clipping there. We're so sorry your son is missing. Here's his medal. Like, and then the sheer relief. So Reading, and this is something that I like to tell people, Reading is, I don't know how this happened, honestly, but we have a guy who was falsely reported as killed in action, and he was actually MIA. Of course, that wasn't Ben, but in the same newspaper clipping where, like, it said, and this is why I didn't use it, because it's so big and I don't want people to think I'm talking about Ben, missing Reading soldiers turn up in prison camps, one thought dead, no longer. But yeah, so they didn't even hear from him while he was in the POW camp at all. And I think part of that is because he was captured so late in the war. But still, they never heard from him. He could have been dead. I mean, so many of the guys from town who were dead were reported MIA and stayed MIA. So finally, when he finally turned up in late May, and his parents got a letter from him in late May. And so they knew he was alive.
Mm.
And so he came home, and of course he came home and was catching up on all the news, and so that's that picture on that first page. But so
Right.
yeah, there. So yeah, everyone's eagerly eating up everything. But
And then we have his post-war time.
yeah, after the war, so he had a pretty happy life. He got married. He lived out the rest of his life, and I believe he lived in Reading for a while, and then he kind of went like what's the guy's name? Christopher McCandless. He just went to Alaska. Ben went to Alaska. I don't know why. I think his wife died in the 60s, I want to say. And so he just buggered off. He buggered off. He went to Alaska. He became like, there's some pictures of him like, he's got like this big beard. He liked biology. He studied
Mm.
biology after the war, and so I kind of imagine that's why he
And
why
and
he
you
wanted
wonder,
to go there.
and I'm immediately thinking, and this is complete conjecture, is that if you've been in a prisoner of war camp, even if it wasn't a very long time, you're crammed in with people. You're in a very
Mm,
unprivate environment where and then the Alaska is the perfect place to go in a way to get away from everybody. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche. I'm sure there are people watching going, no, Alaska isn't all people living in the middle of nowhere, but in my head, it kind of is. And certainly there you can immediately think there's some sense of escape. There's the
I'm
trauma of
sure that drew him.
yeah,
Yeah, even if he found it wasn't true.
and with your wife
100%.
passing away as well, that can I can
Yeah.
really see that. I'm off to Alaska to become a kind of have a big beard and live in the middle of nowhere and
Yeah.
be an ice trucker or whatever the hell it was he was doing. It's but
Yeah.
that brings this interesting angle that you're approaching it from, is that it's all about the people, not about, obviously you're trying to put together the chronicles of their combat and what they were doing and the Silver Star citation, but far more interesting is just the humanity behind it. Why did they enlist? Did they volunteer? Were they drafted?
Mhm.
What did they do? How did it affect them when they came back? That's the
Yeah.
more complete story that tells. It is Reading, Massachusetts, but when this book comes out, it could easily be a town, in California, or a town
That's yeah.
in England. It could be Reading, England. It's the same
Mhm.
experience of a group of men connected geographically, but not necessarily connected with ambitions and drives and personalities.
100%. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I love so much about this project is that I can see this driving through Massachusetts. I see it everywhere. I see just the echoes of what it's like. I mean, and I really would encourage people who want to truly understand the war on a small town level, because so many of us understand the war on a big picture level.
Yeah,
We think of like New York City,
yeah,
like hundreds
yeah,
of
yeah,
thousands of guys left New York City to go off and fight. Well, in a small town, you might only have like 7 guys who served in combat units,
yeah.
and the rest of them were like, and so I really would
And
encourage
and and
people.
and three or four bits of bad news coming consecutively could really upset a
Oh
town,
yeah,
or consequently, two or three bits of really good news. Jim is overseas. He's got married and he's turned up. He's not missing. Could send
yeah,
can send a ripple of positivity around that town, because
exactly,
they're, obviously people in a town are looking at the big headlines. They want to know how the war is being waged and what's happening in Italy, what's happening in Burma, etc., etc. But also what's happening to the people. The
yeah,
guy who runs the barber shop who used to cut these lads' hairs. He's interested in what happened to those people who are sitting in his chair. The person who served gas in the gas station wants to know what happened to the people whose
exactly.
cars he was filling. And so I applaud you for coming at it from this angle, because it's really revealing about not just the people who serve, but the effect on the community as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I think too that in many ways, the people that are left behind at home, and I think this is worth mentioning for all of you who might be wondering, the Reading Chronicle, on the first issue after Pearl Harbor, there's no big headline about Pearl Harbor. The first issue after the invasion of Normandy, there's no big headline about Normandy. What there is the section about all the soldiers and the sailors and the Marines, and that's all it is. It's not a newspaper in that way. It's like a here's what's going on with all the people around town. And
Like a
that's
kind
really
of
the heart
round
of it.
robin Christmas email kind of thing. Yeah,
Yes,
here's what
exactly.
our people have been doing. They are part of something greater, but this is, yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm enjoying this conversation. We've got one more guy to go.
Wesley, yes.
Over to you.
So Wesley Harold Steber, he's an interesting guy, and that's that. There he is in the picture. He comes from a pretty large family from North Reading. The Steber family lived on Lee Road in North Reading, and no street number, because back then they didn't really have many street numbers in North Reading. That's how rural it was. But he was one of, I want to say, four brothers. All four of them served. So there was John. John was in the 7th Quartermaster Company of the 7th Infantry Division. There was Edwin. I want to say Edwin was the 30th Infantry Division. Yeah, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Division. He was captured by the Germans in August 44. And then there's Stanley. Stanley was with the Miracle Division in the Pacific. And then here Wesley was in the Navy, and they had a sister too who was a welder at the Boston Navy Yard. But Wesley was aboard USS LST 344, so we can talk about that. So USS LST 344 was an interesting LST, primarily because it actually stuck around after World War II, and I believe it might be a museum ship. I could be misremembering that, but it's, I believe, known as the USS Blanco County. After the end of the war, it's renamed. But this LST served in pretty much all of the major amphibious invasions in Europe. So they were in Sicily, they were in Italy, and they were in Normandy. And so that picture on the top left is of them landing, I believe, in Sicily. And of course, Wesley was a coxswain's mate. So he was probably manning one of those landing craft. The 344 ran into a lot of trouble. They, especially in Normandy they got attacked by aircraft. And then in Sicily they I think they had some shore battery fire that they were dodging at one point. But he's just an interesting guy to me because he's one of our only guys who served in all major invasions and was on an LST and was a coxswain's mate. Because we've got other guys who were on LSTs that were parts of all these invasions, but they were like an electrician's mate. They probably got nowhere near the beach. But in this case, no. I mean, Wesley would have been there right on through. And I think it's really interesting too, knowing for me, like one of my favorite things is like knowing that like when he was carrying troops into Normandy, and I believe the 344 served on Omaha and Utah. I don't think it really had one. It just made trips back and forth a lot.
Yeah.
Knowing that, I mean, I don't know if he knew it. He might have known it, that his brother in the 30th Division was there. While he was doing those ferrying, obviously they weren't there on the first day or the first few days yet, but like knowing that his brother was there. I mean, that to me is like one of the coolest things about this is like, we have another two Ingalls brothers, Walter and William. Walter was in the 29th Infantry Division Headquarters Company in the finance section. He didn't come in on the first day, but his brother was in the 8th Infantry Regiment, the 4th Division, in the first wave on Utah. And so they were there. They were both there within miles of each other. They probably didn't know it. Or if they did, I'm sure they weren't thinking about it. I'm sure it was the last thing on their minds. But as soon as they were on the beach, they were like, "Where's my brother?" Where is he? Especially, I'm sure Walter, who was the finance guy, was like, "Where's William?" And then the knowledge that William would go on to be killed. So I mean, like, I think of the Steber brothers as just the knowledge on Wesley's part and probably on Edwin's part, especially since Edwin would have been able to see the big 344 on the actual side of the ship and know that's my brother's ship. Just the kind of the emotional value of that presence, I think is quite interesting. So
No, I mean it is. I mean, I was literally on Omaha Beach today with the historian Garrett Graff, who's writing. He wrote a best-selling book about 9/11 oral histories and did one on Watergate. And now he's doing a D-Day one, and I'm helping him a little bit by showing him around. And we're
Yeah.
talking about LSDs today, and yes, in terms of bringing ashore the logistics, bringing ashore the units. But if your brother is on one and you see that number, all you're thinking about is my brother could be on there somewhere. Where is he right now? Is he on deck? Is he and that again, it brings us back to this unique approach you're coming from. You're not trying to prove that a unit was doing most or was contributing most to the war or less to the
Yeah.
war, or you're simply trying to connect people through this geographical coincidence, really,
Yeah.
and get across their range of experiences, whether or not they were having a large impact on the war or a small impact on the war.
Yeah.
It was having an impact on them as individuals.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and we have a lot of guys who ran into each other, especially in the Pacific, because the 182nd Infantry Regiment was one of the 26th Yankee Division's regiments. So the 26th, for those of you that don't know, is Massachusetts' National Guard division. The 182nd was the 4th Regiment, and it got split off when they triangularized in 41.
Mm.
So the 182nd was this lone regiment, and then they sent it off to New Caledonia in the Pacific. And so a lot of our guys were in that regiment, and we had like one guy, Fred Melvin Day, who was randomly assigned as a replacement officer to the 37th Division, which was an Ohio division. And imagine the surprise of a bunch of Reading guys when they're walking around Bougainville, and they run into Fred Day. And it's like, what are you doing here? Like that Spider-Man meme, like, what? What are
Mm.
you doing here? And just the sheer joy. One of my favorite stories too is like we had a guy who was a POW, and his POW camp was liberated, and he was one of the walking guys. He could walk, and so they told him to start walking back towards where the tanks were coming. And he's walking by, and he sees sitting on top of one of the tanks a guy he graduated from high school with. And they stop the entire tank column, and everyone's screaming at them because he jumps off the front of the tank and like runs up to Elmer and is like, Elmer! And they have this reunion in the middle of a war zone.
Wow.
Things like that. That's the stuff that you don't really think about when you're just focusing on a very specific part of the war.
Brilliant. Well, so we have kind of brought the 4 stories to an end there. I mean, as you said on the slide there, came back, lived to 78. That's not a particularly long life. Do we know why it was he didn't live too long?
No, I found this with some guys. There were a lot of guys that died in the late 70s and like the early 80s. It's very difficult to find cause of death unless
Mm.
they say it in an obituary or if it's in an
But it's an
accident.
interesting thing because we have a handful of World War II veterans left, and they're 99 and 103 and
Right.
104. There is this idea that lots of them live to be 100, and the tragedy is not a lot of them died years and years ago. A lot of them
Yeah.
didn't even make their 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
And it can be through just they might have died young anyway, but you have to kind of connect the dots and say that traumatic experiences, injuries, wounds, exposure to disease, climates, all the other things that these guys
100%.
went through, and then potential alcoholism and
Of
difficulty,
course.
all that is connects to it. So I think this idea that every veteran gets to live to 103 and
No.
be is it's great that those few do, but
Of
many
course.
didn't.
Oh yeah.
Many didn't. And so we'll bring things to an end in a minute, but we've talked about the project, the books, the process of putting it all together. The simple question is why? Why are you doing this? I mean, it's great. We're not judging you. We're saying it's a great thing, but why? What started it all off for you?
So for me, I had a very complicated upbringing. I like tell people, and like this is gonna like make your eyes turn into question marks. That's okay. It's okay. Just I tell people jokingly, even though it's true. I technically have 4 mothers and 2 dads. I have biological parents, adoptive parents, and then 2 former foster parents. So genealogy and understanding my family has always been something of great
Right.
interest to me. Um, so when I was in my like freshman year of high school, that's when I really got interested in genealogy. Um, it was actually because my mom said, "Hey, we're going to be going on a trip to Nova Scotia over the summer." And I mentioned it to my adoptive mother, who also happens to be my biological aunt, so blood relative. And she was like, "Oh, your grandfather was from Nova Scotia." And that, like, my ADHD sent me on like a whirlwind of rabbit hole. And so for our great trip to Nova Scotia, instead of going to like Halifax or something, we went to this tiny little town called Pictou, in the northern corner of Nova Scotia. That's where my entire family was from. And I got to visit the grave of my fourth great grandfather, which was surreal. He was born in 1800 and died in 1885. Like, really crazy that I was able to touch the grass on top of him. That for me was really how I got interested in history and stuff. And then I started to explore my biological father's side of the family, which was complicated because I've never met him, but I knew he came from a big family. So I literally, like, I found one obituary and I had all the siblings and and I found out my first cousin 4 times removed. I was kind of confused because he was born in 1889 and he died in 1918. And I was like, huh. And I was like, well, he was in the Navy, and like World War I, especially for the US, is not known for its naval battles. Well, he died of the Spanish flu. He died of the Spanish flu October 11th, 1918, a month before the war ended. And then his wife gave birth to their only child like 2 days after he died. And so then I found from there, like, just coincidentally, I found on the other little like branch, my second great uncle was killed at the Battle of Montserrat in the First World War with the Canadian cavalry. And so then I kind of that's how I got into military history. That's how that started. I was like, well, my family clearly got their butts kicked in by this. Like, I almost everyone in my family who was old enough, and then people even who were too old. There were a few guys in my family who lied and literally did the math out on their attestation papers, which cracks me up. Served in World War I. So I got into World War I, and then my senior year of high school, COVID hit. March 13th, 2020 was my last day of school. I went home. I was invited to write for my school newspaper. I did that, and then that got me a job offer from my local paper to write for them over the summer. And I was like, sure, but I don't have anything to write about because everyone is quarantining, and it's a really sad time. Like, there are a lot of horrible things happening in the world. So that's where this idea came from. I was like, oh, why don't I take people back in time? And I foolishly thought to myself, oh, Reading is an old town. It's not that small. Surely we have a few guys.
Yeah, and it snowballed. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really how it started. Is I said to myself, oh, I won't find anything. But I sat down with Ken Burns's documentary, The War, a box of goldfish, and Ancestry.com open and sorted for Reading draft cards. And like I said, and I will never forget, the first draft card I opened was Frederick John Estes Jr., 118 Bancroft Avenue. And the top of the card, in all caps, handwriting, red pen, deceased. And it had just so happened that I opened one out of the 2,730 something cards. I opened one that belonged to a guy who was killed. And at that point, it was out of my hands. I was kind of just going where they were taking me. And so and the community, the way the community responded to it too was a big deal. A lot of the relatives that I first met, like in those first few months, I still talk to.
Wow. And that's that thing. It's been all sorts of guests on my channel. Is where did that interest come from? Did it start wide and go narrow? Did it start narrow and go wide? And there's no reason why and how you become one of the afflicted, as we have ways called it, and there's people who I know don't consider themselves a historian yet, although they have read a huge amount and they know a huge amount. It's because they haven't really found their their niche thing to get into, and it's maybe it'll be the town they're from, maybe it'll be a particular unit, maybe it'll be a particular campaign or story.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. You don't know quite when it's going to happen, but when it does happen, it pulls you down the direction that you then can't get out. I mean, when I first came to Normandy, I had no idea that I'd end up moving here and living here for so long, and loving it. So it's brilliant, and people are, obviously there's lots of comments in the sidebar about your enthusiasm and how brilliant it is, and the approach you're bringing is, we've said it is it's not unique. I've seen other people focusing on town,
Yeah.
but it's certainly interesting, and the angle is good. So, well, we wish you luck with it. And when you've got the first book or a set of books or the contract signed, you can come back and tell us about that. And you've only done 4 of the guys, so theoretically there's another
Oh yeah.
153
There
we
are
can
many.
cover. But by that time, you'll have found a few more. So there's
Yes.
plenty of mileage in this. So
Yes.
well, thank you, Autumn, for joining us. And folks, we're back with Helen Fry tomorrow to talk about women intelligence. Thanks for your comments and questions. And Autumn, thanks for being a fantastic guest. And I will talk to you again soon. Thank you, everybody. And it's Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying see you all next time. Bye.